Last night, February 8th, 2024, Tucker Carlson released a interview with Vladimir Putin in Moscow. Now, many reacted to the news of the interview coming out with a lot of vitriol. Why would Tucker Carlson go to Russia and interview Vladimir Putin? What is he, some sort of traitor? Why would he go to the middle of a country that we are really at war with and interview their leader? Because that's what journalists do. Tucker Carlson is simply doing what journalists are supposed to be doing, going and interviewing interesting and important figures. Whether it be Vladimir Putin, whether it be Boris Johnson, whether it be Angela Merkel, or whether it be Kim Jong-un. A journalist should seek to go out and to interview figures who are highly significant to world events and who hold influence. Vladimir Putin holds influence. 15 years ago, if Carlson would have went out and done what he did yesterday, he would be winning awards. But what happened? Why is he getting criticized now? It's because the media does not want you to know the truth. I'm not saying that Vladimir Putin tells the truth. Vladimir Putin very well could have lied in many places in that interview, and there are a few places where I think he might have. But the truth is always somewhere within the middle of two narratives. For the last 2 years, we've only heard the Ukrainian side of the story. That's the only narrative that's been acceptable to hear. Now, Tucker out, and he is exposed to the other side of the narrative, a different narrative coming from Russia. If you take these two pieces together, you should be able to find the truth somewhere. Now, I will say I'm more apt to believe Putin than I am Zelensky. I don't believe either of them, honestly, on all of the facts. But I do think, honestly, that Putin would be a lot more honest than Zelensky is. But I do think that both of them run corrupt governments, and both of them have a lot of issues in their own country. Now, obviously with that, you would take everything in this interview with a grain of salt. Something that was impressive to me is that when Tucker asked his first question, Putin went into this 30-minute history lesson starting in the 800s, not 800s AD, and looking at what was going on throughout most of Russian history and how we got to the point where we're at now. Do you know any Americans that could recall our history going back to Jamestown? Do you know many? Now, I'm not saying that the average Russian could go out and do that, but it is still a striking difference that we have a leader here in the United States who is very often accused of having dementia, whereas they have a leader who is incredibly intelligent and can rattle off thousands of years of history like it's nothing. That's highly impressive. Highly impressive. I'm a history major. I don't even know if I could do that. I could go back through the history of the church and look at important highlights, but I couldn't rattle off random facts, names, and dates like they were nothing, and yet Vladimir Putin could. And of course, maybe he got one or two details wrong here or there, but you're only human. You're not going to get everything right? That's what I figure. But it was very, very shocking, and it also, to me, it struck a chord with how the differences between how Westerners here in the United States view the world and how Russians and Easterners and a lot of people in Eastern Europe and Russia and Asia view the world. We tend to look at things in a very narrow scope. We look at the immediate. We look at, okay, what just happened, what is about to happen or what might be about to happen, what's going on now. That's all we focus on. It's not very often. It's only in the rare circumstance in some debates that you hear people appeal farther back than 100 or 200 years ago. Most of the time it's Civil War. A lot of times they'll go to the founding, but most of the time it's just what's happened since World War II. The post-war consensus is the basis for most of what we think and what we believe and how we look at history. And that's just not how they think over there. In Russia, it's all important. From the very first moment of their conception to now. everything in between. It's all important. It's this wide span of history that matters to them. Every single detail. Everything matters. Not just what just immediately happened. They don't discard their history like a lot of us do. In fact, here in the United States, a lot of us are taught to be ashamed of our past. We're taught to be ashamed of our history. There are so many ugly things in our history. How could you ever be proud? That's what we're told on a regular basis. What I believe is that all history is important. What I believe is that the good, the bad, and the ugly all work together to form a narrative, especially for a country, a narrative of how that country is run and where it's going. We should be proud of our history, even the parts that aren't pretty. And we should be teaching it to our children and learning it ourselves if we don't already know it. Now that tangent's over with, Putin, I want to focus in mainly on Putin seems to heavily talk about the Russian relationship with NATO, and it struck a chord with me with how Russia has historically kind of been treated by the rest of Europe. If you look throughout Russia's history, Russia has always been regarded as kind of this backwater, backwards country, not much going on, not of his significance or importance. The rest of Europe looked at Russia with contempt. That's just always been part of its history. Even during the reign of Peter the Great, Peter the Great instituted reforms to try and westernize the country to make them more palatable and more acceptable to the rest of Europe. And even then, they still viewed them the same way that they did for hundreds and thousands of years prior. And so it's interesting to see, it's interesting to see how that has translated now, because you kind of have the same thing going on. Putin mentioned many times during the interview, and it's imperative that we go back and kind of look and see if this does actually follow the facts of what happened. But Putin seemed to imply several times that Russia just wanted peace with NATO, and in fact that they'd be willing to join NATO if given the opportunity. And Russia, the impression on many and on many Americans, obviously I was not alive, so I don't know for sure, but just hearing from folks like my parents, the impression on many Americans and on many Russians was that once the Cold War was over and the Soviet Union collapsed, things would be peaceful. In fact, you had American secretaries of state like Donald Rumsfeld, who multiple times warned, okay, we gotta be careful with NATO. We can't provoke Russia. We've won. So why would you do anything to provoke them? Why would you take that risk? And instead, NATO didn't listen. NATO ignored the advice of Americans like Rumsfeld not to expand. They went against the wishes of Russians who asked them just plainly, hey, we want to be peaceful. Please don't scare us. And they expanded east. They made a promise they would not go 1 inch east, and they broke it. NATO's not completely in the clear. I'm not saying Russia's in the clear either. I don't think that you should invade another country to settle your differences. But at the same time, you can see how in their minds they think that this is justified. And I'm not saying it is or it isn't. I think Ukraine has a lot of problems. I think especially has a lot of problems. In fact, I recently wrote for my school newspaper, The Champion, on why I think that the U.S. should leave NATO. And part of it is because they keep doing suicidal stuff like this and trying to make us pay for it. They keep trying to drag us into their wars and have our sons die on veil for a war that we shouldn't even be a part of. And last night you saw Putin didn't really want to be a part of it either. Now, you can believe him or not, but from my perception, it seems to me that the only reason he went into Russia was because he was doing what he thought was right to protect his own people. Whether or not it actually was right, that's a different story. We can have that conversation. But in his mind, he's doing what he needs to protect his country. That's the sign of a true nationalist, a patriot. And honestly, I don't think that we need leaders who would go into other countries just because think that it's in our best interest and protection. We've already had that for the last few years with Obama and Bush. But we do need leaders who care. We need leaders who love our country and care about our country and want to see the best for it. That's why I endorse Donald Trump. I think he's one of those people. Think he's perfect? No. Do I think all of his policies are going to play out correctly? Probably, maybe not. Maybe I'm not sure. But do I think he was a perfect president when he was president? No. But he's someone that you can tell loves the country. It's obvious. And we need more people in office. We are seriously lacking in people that are in love with this nation. We're also seriously lacking in people with intelligence. And I do want to get to the Biden press conference here in a minute, but I want to focus a couple more things with this interview first. Something that was really interesting to me with Putin, and this is something that I noticed. I'm not sure if this is something that necessarily stands out to other people, but something that struck me was how in the interview he kept making appeals to Christianity. He talked about how ancestors of the Russians baptized the country, how ancient leaders baptized the country. He kept talking about how Christianity was an important part of the social and cultural part of Russia, especially Orthodoxy. And it was very, very interesting to see him. Tucker asked him point blank, do you think that there are supernatural forces working on what's going on? Essentially, in my mind, that question was, well, do you recognize the sovereign God and what's going on in all of this? Because you and I, we know God is sovereign over all human affairs. But Putin denied that. He said that the only things that were working on the country were the laws of nature. What? I understand that that Eastern Orthodoxy has a much different theological system and view than Protestantism, especially Reformed Protestantism like what I follow. But it's still interesting and striking to me that he denied that God is sovereign over what's going on and that he would say it's just the laws of nature. It's interesting. It's very interesting. Putin is an interesting person. I don't think that he is the maniacal dictator, evil ruler who's hell-bent on taking over the entire world like our media portrays him as. But I don't think he's a saint either. He obviously runs an authoritarian government. Tucker Carlson pressed him on why he had an American journalist in jail. Putin said he was spying. Tucker dismissed that claim and pushed back against it. Quite bravely, I thought. And you kind of see Putin just try to work around it and brush it off. So Putin is a very interesting figure. Someone who... he's very complex. And complex people are hard to place. Especially in a world now where we have a lot of people who aren't that complex. They're very shallow. Most of the people that you and I know today are very shallow people. Putin doesn't fit that description. There's something more going on here. And it'll be interesting to see how this interview ages and what comes out of this in the long run.